Hello everyone and welcome. I'm Oliver Mantell, Director of Evidence and Insight at the Audience Agency, and by way of visual description, I am a middle-aged, blonde-haired, white male. Yeah, and that's probably about as much description as I need, hopefully. We are going to be talking this morning about audiences and the population of East London, as the latest in our series of place events where we've been looking at different places around the country and looking at what we can say in aggregate from our data. Do please, as Myri's just done, introduce yourself in the chat. That would be great, and also do chip in with comments and questions in there, or indeed out loud if you would like on the way through. As will become evident, you will know a lot more about East London as a sort of lived experience than I do, but hopefully I can say some things to the data, you can say some things about what you're seeing in practice, and we can kind of share thoughts and experiences. So there'll be a chance for a bit of a chat later on as well, just to kind of work out how it all fits together, what we're saying and what you're seeing. So just in terms of practicalities, before we start, you'll have noticed this session is being recorded. We won't record the chat bit, so if you say anything that's just to be shared between people here, then that's how it'll stay. And there is also transcription sort of automatically if you need it in the via the toolbar. But do, again, if you've got any questions, do please speak up. So here we go, East London. Today's event is going to be something, it has sort of slightly bittersweet quality for me, because on the one hand, you get to be the first people in the world's probably a bit grand, but you get to be the first people that see a kind of sneak peek of some new enhancements to audience spectrum that we've been doing. So our kind of segmentation model that we work with, we've been doing some work behind the scenes for a little while now, and you will get the first little glimpse of that. It's only a little bit, but I'm really interested to see what you think about that. So that's the sweet bit, the bitter bit, and this is Elise has been chuckling as we go around all these different events. I have sort of personal links to in some various different places we've been to, but this is the sort of slightly sad one, because in the process of researching this, I discovered that I don't have a Cockney grandma. I've long thought I had a Cockney grandma, and in the process of looking at this, I was looking at various maps, as we will see if the thing goes forward, that show how far the reach of the Boroughs goes, which of course is the defining quality of whether you're born as Cockney. And I discovered that because she lived in East Ham, it's outside the line. So sadly, in the last couple of days in preparing this, I've lost a Cockney grandma, but nonetheless, there you go. These things happen. She's still well within our area of remit in terms of what we're looking at, and a very fine grandma anyway. So, so what we're going to be looking at then is about the local area, the local population, looking at some audience data of various sorts, a bit of a chat, and then sort of looking at what it all might mean. So hopefully that's what everyone's kind of expecting. I will, by way of intro, just say a little bit about some of the data sources, and also a little bit about audience spectrum. So for some of you, that'll be really familiar. For others, it may not be, and if it isn't with you, so really need to know it to be able to follow the latest stuff. So, I'll sort of with apologies, if you've heard it all before, then rest assured there'll be other bits which will be new. So in terms of the information that we'll be sharing, we'll be looking at a whole load of different levels of granularity, or drawing data that sort of applies on different levels of granularity. So we've got some information on a UK-wide level from the Cultural Participation Monitor, which is a nationally representative panel survey that we've been doing in a series of waves throughout COVID since October 2020. And we've literally just completed the fieldwork for wave 6. So again, you're getting a very early peek of some of the findings relating to that, I think. Or at least we'll reference them in terms of how things are going. Then we've also got that information split down to the London level, as well as things like audience spectrum and some information from Audience Finder, which is the data aggregation service that we run, which indeed many of you are part of. And that will be looking partly at survey level, but as we get more granular, just at ticketing data. And then there's a wide range of other sort of secondary data sources at a borough or at a more granular ward level. So that's what we're going to be looking at. And specifically, this is the geography we're looking at. So these 7 boroughs. So essentially stretching out from sort of the east of central London right out to the M25. So technically, I guess, this is the first of the local events that is local to the audience agency, in as much as our offices in Richmix are actually in Tower Hamlets. So we're kind of just on the edge of that the western edge of the area. We will, of course, see, you will, of course, already know, just quite how much it varies in terms of population and geography within this area. To some extent, following the kind of classic London mayoral election maps you see with a kind of like, you know, Labour centre, and then it all gets so much more sort of leafy and suburban and Conservatives you get further out. And we see that even within this slice. You don't need to get past the M25 for that effect to kick in. So that's what we'll be looking at. And yes, let's head on. So just briefly, for those who are less familiar with audience spectrum, this is the segmentation model that the audience agency uses to summarize the whole population of the UK based on their amount and type of cultural engagement and sort of, you know, attitudes and, you know, what they call preferences and that kind of thing. So broadly speaking, the whole population is split out into these 10 groups, which cluster into some highly engaged ones, some middle engaged ones, and of course, some lower engaged ones. So because this segmentation applies across the whole country, these 10 types, you know, kind of quite widely spread, and London has particular concentrations of some of them more than others. So I'll probably particularly focus on highlighting some of those now, and then we'll talk about those in particular as well relative to London, including the sneak peek of the additional layer of breakdown later on. So of the highly engaged ones, London's sort of quite blessed in this respect, in that of the 3 segments that are really prominent in London, 2 out of 3 are what we call highly engaged segments. So there's metroculturals, which is the highest engaged segment, which is most heavily concentrated in London, and it tends to be kind of which are affluent professionals, very high cultural engagement, but also, you know, that potentially looking for the best of the best in terms of culture. But with, you know, they're prepared to pay for it. They're prepared to kind of, you know, book in advance to, you know, get their memberships at national, etc., etc. Then we have the other key group in London from the highly engaged ones is experience seekers. So these tend also to be graduates like metroculturals, but they tend to be a bit younger. They tend to engage in quite a sort of diverse variety of art forms, but with a particular skew towards things like visual arts and things which are free or lower cost or more experimental. So there's quite a lot of those in the mix around here. And of course, when you do get further out, you do start getting into the commuter belt and get the commuter land culture buffs who are kind of highly engaged, but older, more traditional, etc. The other segment we have lots of in London is kaleidoscope creativity. So whatever the clock on the dial, so to speak, where it tends to be, it's relatively diverse as a segment in terms of at least ethnicity, the tendency to be a bit younger, lots of people living in sort of urban flats and tower blocks and quite, you know, often quite small households. So lots of single person households, for example, but sort of, you know, quite early in life, but a little bit less kind of financially established maybe than some of the other the groups we've just been talking about. And there are absolutely loads of kaleidoscope creativity in East London. I mean, I knew there were going to be a lot, but it's, yeah, I was surprised quite how many. This is partly because being based in Sheffield, I don't do a lot of work in London, probably because we have so many other staff who know London really well. Anyway, so that's a brief tour of the segments and sort of putting out a few of the key ones. Of course, you know, there's lots of other types I haven't dwelt on so much, and we'll maybe bump into some of those later on. But for now, those are the three really key ones to bear in mind. Everyone happy so far? Everything for making sense. Great. So in terms of audience spectrum itself, I said that it's sort of based on behavior and attitudes and amount of engagement. It was built from the Taking Part survey, which is a DCMS run attitudinal survey or behavioral survey. So that was what was originally used to create those 10 different segments. We've then populated it with a range of other information from Experian, from the census, from various other places. But of course, as we've been using it with Audience Finder over the years, we've also got a more kind of nuanced understanding of some of these groups by seeing what happens in actual ticketing data and actual survey data and kind of responses and so forth. So that's all kind of fed in, and indeed has informed this little extra enhancement that we'll be talking about in a sec. Each one has a little summary profile. So this is the experience seekers that we will see a fair bit of today. They have a little overall summary you see there, as well as sort of statistical appendices and stuff to download, information about their interests, comms preferences, art form tastes, etc. These are all also in the process of being refreshed and revised. So again, you'll see that changing over the next few weeks as well. But if you want to know any more about any of these segments, if you just go to the Audience Agency website, there's lots more about each of them there. And all of that is freely available. There's also free mapping available through the Audience Finder website. So if you want to see where they all are, if you log into Audience Finder Original, there's a section where you can literally look at the counts of each of these groups by postcode sector. So, gamble over. So who have we got in the local area? So we'll be looking at a bit of demographic information, spectrum information, and also a little bit of stuff from the participation. So these are roughly arranged west to east, or sort of inner to outer, in terms of London. And you can see a kind of, in terms of the proportion of households that have children in them, it kind of swells as you go out and then drops off a bit once you sort of get a little bit further out towards the M25. So much lower levels in Hackney and Tower Hamlets, perhaps unsurprisingly, but then as gradually you move out into these other areas, particularly the highest proportion of children and families in Barking and Dagenham. So what we will tend to see in this data is that of the 7 boroughs, there are sort of like 4 groupings. The first 2, much more sort of edge of inner London. Then the next 3, Barking is a sort of slight law unto itself in terms of different profile and population, and then Havering, you know, is a bit further out. So if the sort of proportion of families goes that way and sort of like, you know, low to high, the actual population is kind of drifting the other direction. So obviously the most densely populated areas being nearer the middle. So that's probably, again, not a surprise. That would be how things you would expect them to usually spread out. We do see a little bit of a different mix in terms of population as we get to different areas. So those 2 very much more inner London areas, quite high levels of employment, you know, moderate to high levels of students, still you know, good, you know, large numbers of students in Newham, but the overall employment levels a bit down, and then employment levels gradually sort of rise as you head out. Again, with Barking and Dagenham being the kind of slight sort of glitch in the neat trend. You know, they're sort of behaving just slightly differently. You know, but not radically so. But you know, you see the student numbers dropping off. You see the overall employment levels just a little bit lower. Okay. And the age profile, again, if we just focus initially on that really large 3rd bar down, the 25 to 44-year-olds, that sort of tends to do a bit of a sort of sweep downwards, which is quite interesting because often that's the group that has children. and therefore you'd expect it to be following the same curve as where the families are, but it doesn't quite. So, for example, Barking and Dagenham has joint second lowest proportion of people in that age group, despite having the highest proportion of families. So there's maybe more sort of older and younger families in the mix there. But the proportion of 65 pluses, or retirees, I guess, does tend to head upwards as you go out of the centre, as you probably would expect. Probably what's happening is, and we'll see this in the profiling, that the kind of affluent professionals living on the edge of the centre, edge of zone 1, I guess, is what's pushing those figures up. And obviously they may well be living there in flats without families. Then in terms of the profile in terms of ethnicity, again, we see that sort of similar dynamic happening, where the kind of edge of inner London professionals has, I mean, it's a very diverse area in general, with the exception of Havering, but the kind of gradual increase in the proportion of white residents as you go out is mitigated by the fact that right in this very, very central area, again, it becomes quite a bit more socially exclusive again in terms of Hackney and Tower Hamlets, but it's still very diverse compared to obviously lots of other areas. We're also seeing obviously quite big differences in terms of the relative proportions of the Asian and Black population within each of these different areas. So, for example, Barking has a higher Black than Asian population. That's very much not the case in Tower Hamlets and Redbridge, etc. Okay. So, in many ways, that kind of demographic overview is it's very broad brush. It's what we kind of, it's like a very basic starting point that we just have to be aware of to then overlay over some of the other things we're looking at. And again, it'll all be stuff that you broadly speaking know. However, now we start to look at the profile in terms of audience spectrum, we can see something quite interesting, I think, which is that this is showing East London, London and England as the three comparators, and East London and London are both clearly markedly different from the English average overall. So really heavy concentrations on these three segments. But essentially what's happened is that for East London compared to London as a whole, there's 15% more kaleidoscope creativity, 15% fewer metroculturals. So there's a kind of a bit of a tilt there. So that you've got, 4 in 10 people are within this very, this very particular segment, this kaleidoscope creativity, which obviously you then compare it to England as a whole, it's a massive, massive overrepresentation. Despite the fact that's a group that does appear, right across the rest of the country. It's not that it's London only in the way that metroculturals sometimes feel like they are. But you essentially, you've got the London profile with metroculturals down, kaleidoscope creativity up. And the reason that is quite interesting is that metroculturals are more likely to engage in terms of a wide variety of cultural engagement than kaleidoscope creativity are. And so what happens when you actually look at the engagement picture is that East London resets to look like the London population. So because of the fact that one's down and one's up, they kind of like then go back again by the same, essentially by about the same amounts. So whereas across other bits of London, there are more metroculturals and they're overrepresented, so they end up massively overrepresented. In East London, the population skews one way, the bias in how they attend skews the other way, and it kind of pulls it back into line compared to the overall London population. So attenders in East London look like the population of London, essentially, despite the fact that the population skews. Does that make sense? I saw the odd frown there on camera, but hopefully I made sense of that. So it's just quite an interesting picture, essentially. What it means is that if you look at the audience in the venues, probably looking much more like London as a whole. Now this is a sneaky peek of extra information. And this is literally the first time anyone has seen this. So So what we've done is we've taken the audience spectrum segments and we've split each of them into two subsegments based on kind of various commonalities in terms of behavior and profile and, you know, and lifestyle and so forth. And we can see that where we've been talking at an overall level about, you know, London has lots of metrocultural and East London, it does, but not quite so much. If we start looking sort of under the bonnet of that and say, well, what sort of metroculturals? Out of the widespread of metroculturals there are, which are more or less represented, we can then see that metroculturals who are in East London tend to be sort of what we've called group M2, metroculturals 2, younger, mobile, emerging metropolitan professionals. So it's those flats in the East End, as opposed to some of the metroculturals that might be, let's say, out in Kensington and Chelsea and whatever, who would be the older, more established, high spending. So they're all metroculturals, but the skew in East London is towards these types. So they tend to be a bit younger. So in some ways, they look a little bit more like experience seeker metroculturals. You see what I mean? They're kind of somewhere in that territory between them. But of the experience seekers, there is a little bit of a bias towards people in the experience seeker groups who are either still students or living in student areas or recent graduates, and with a tendency to live in much more diverse areas, which obviously fits with what we've seen about the background population being very, very diverse part of the city. But what it hopefully gives us a bit of a sense of is that behind that overall profile of there's lots of these two major groups, there is a bit more of a kind of bit more nuance there in terms of the difference. It also means that we can look at it and see that whereas 75% of the population would be within 3 of these groups, once you add the extra layer, you get 6 different groups that make up the same proportion, which is largely but not exclusively these. In fact, there's, I think, one of the others leapfrogs one of these subsegments. But kaleidoscope creativity, there are different types of them and different concentrations of different sort of lifestyle types within kaleidoscope creativity, but actually both are really well represented in this area. So the 2 largest subsegments are both kaleidoscope creativity in this area. So it's not just a kind of one particular group being really preponderant, it's got both. So this is very much the kind of kaleidoscope creativity heartland of all types. Does that make sense? Particularly for those who may have seen the kind of top level of audience spectrum before, but seeing a little bit of sort of exploring under the bonnet. Enhanced segmentation is great to see. When would it be available to us all to use? Very soon. And the fact that we have it ready as is, we're probably talking the middle of April for it being kind of public more fully. We are doing a little bit of trial work with a few different organisations, and indeed, if you're really keen to see your audience looked at this way, then let us know. So maybe you want one of the trial organisations to where we could look at that. But yes, I'm aware as well that various of my colleagues have done quite a bit of work with using the home, haven't they? So they'll probably know quite a lot about how the segmentation applies for you, as I'm sure you do as well. Okay, so does that give a little bit of an extra flavour, and hopefully that'll also mean that those of you that are using audience spectrum in London will find it just a little bit easier to differentiate. So I know that there have been suggestions it's been a little bit always the same 3 groups. Where are we? So this then is going back up to the top level audience spectrum and looking at how it varies by borough. So keeping it to kind of manageable levels of complexity. So as an overall big picture, we can see that all of the metroculturals are piled into those 2 inner London boroughs of the area. So really very high concentration of metroculturals there. Again, hitting the sort of 40–45% of the whole borough in that group, which, as I say, given I do lots of work outside of London, it's just it's weird seeing metroculturals being that high. Usually you see 4% and get excited. So yeah, 40 is quite something. On the other hand, you see the kind of gradual rise of experience seekers as you go out, and then it drops off again when you get past Waltham Forest, etc. The middle engaged segments will tend to be sort of pushed further towards periphery, and indeed, if we were heading yet further out past the M25, we'd probably see more of those groups in greater concentrations. So they're largely there in Havering. Facebook families is an interesting group, which tends to be, roughly speaking, sort of quite digitally engaged with low-income families, and they're, in terms of East London, very heavily concentrated in Barking and Dagenham, and also I imagine something of a focus for the CPP. And kaleidoscope creativity, we can see it's big everywhere until you get to Havering, and then it just drops off completely. Although particular concentrations in Newham, but really it's just it's big right across the board. Again, seeing that group over 60% is really quite stark, but hopefully the increased granularity of the extra layer will start to make that a little bit more nuanced. And there are very few heydays, generally speaking. So I think in terms of organisations who are here, obviously Shoreditch Town Hall, Whitechapel Gallery, etc., you're all very much on the western end of this whole area. I'm trying to think which other organisations are here. Is there anyone sort of surprised by the profile they're seeing, or concentrations in particular patches? Could I explain heydays? Yes, I can. So in fact, heydays, I've been spending lots of time talking about heydays in the last week, because it's it's one of two segments we're going to rename in the new version at the top level. So we're not changing who's in it, but we are going to rename it. But we haven't quite worked out the name. So if anyone has any great ideas after my description, then please tell me. I'll be very, very grateful. But heydays are essentially about 2/3 of them are older, sort of 60 plus, but there is a substantial-ish minority who are much younger. They tend to be the lowest engaged in terms of cultural activity and cultural engagement, particularly amongst sort of publicly funded art forms, but actually in terms of lots of engagement in general. That's partly often driven by ill health, which could be age-related, certainly in that 2/3, but it could also just be about sort of general ill health and or disability. Also a tendency towards very low incomes, or being on state pension, or kind of universal credit, etc. A bit of a skew towards, or quite a heavy skew towards, living either in residential accommodation or sheltered housing, or if not that, then probably council housing. But essentially, people who are in sheltered housing are probably in this group, but not vice versa in terms of the logic of that, if that makes sense. So they are a bigger proportion of the national population than you're seeing here. I can't remember off the top of my head what the figure was from the earlier slide, but they're relatively less represented in London. Again, because London skews young in general, and this category skews quite a lot older. But there are some of them, and where they exist, they're more concentrated in Barking. Oh, other questions? 5%. Thank you, Elise. There we are. So yes, the White House, a fairly unique audience. The impression I've been getting is that Barking and Dagenham is different from elsewhere, and not just in a kind of obvious targeted priority area because there's low engagement. It just feels like the profile is different. Do you say anything more about what you find distinctive about the audience on your doorstep? If that's not an unfair question. I've lost the chat, so I can't see who was asking the question. Sorry, or who was making the comment. That was. Oh, it was just largely they're difficult to engage. Very proud of the local area, suspicious of arts organisations. Yeah, okay, makes sense. Yes, I did have a little bit of a kind of Google Maps walk around Barking and Dagenham, which again is one of those little handy tricks for getting a bit of a feel for an area and an audience, alongside the kind of using politics as a shortcut. And it did feel quite different for some of the other bits of London. It felt much more suburban in some ways. It felt recognisable to certain areas of Sheffield in a way that really surprised me. But that may have just been the bits I picked. Lovely. Okay. So let's have a look here. So this is just Elise very kindly, and if I haven't made it clear enough already, Elise has done loads of the work on this and deserves enormous amounts of credit. But Elise spotted that we had this thing where Havering was behaving a bit oddly compared to everywhere else, and that comparing it to the London profile, it seemed like a real outlier, but that it looked kind of familiar once you drop in a southeast profile. So essentially what we can see is that Havering behaves like the southeast to a very great extent, much less than it behaves like London. So although it's technically part of London, in many ways, from an audience perspective, it's kind of practically maybe better considered as part of a wider southeast. It has a lower proportion of commuter land culture buffs because they do tend to be more concentrated in more rural areas, but otherwise it's much more similar across the board. So maybe something worth noting for those who are verging onto that area. And that kaleidoscope creativity picture kind of tells its own story, doesn't it? Both very, very low compared to London. So we have put in some beautiful maps to add a little bit of visual variety, but also to show where some of these different groups are most concentrated within London. So again, reinforcing the picture we've talked about, the metroculturals, the light blue ones are heavily skewed to the west, with some exceptions, and I've just had a complete mental blank of the that sort of Olympic Park and north, isn't it? That kind of blue strand. Elise, can you?
Yeah, if I'm not mistaken, I think that's sort of the central line going up towards Leytonstone, so a bit east of the Olympic Park.
Okay. So there's a pocket of the metroculturals there. Experience seekers skewed west, but in sort of more sort of scattered, and obviously with a little outlying pocket up there. Dormitory dependables are in fact the largest group, though they've never stuck out overall in terms of the profile. Within some of these more peripheral areas, they are there in reasonable numbers, mixed in with some commuter land culture buffs, and that's again, you can see Havering behaving very, very differently to everywhere else. And we do see these pockets of Facebook families. We saw lots of them in Barking and Dagenham, and that's where they are, very much concentrated in that bit. And some of the other kind of mid-engaged groups are present, but only in the sort of outlying pockets. Now, it is worth noting that this is just which group is biggest in an area. So various different groups could be represented in other places, but we do see quite sharp concentrations, as I think we're about to see in a sec. If we just look at the data in Audience Finder, we can see that actually, if I go between the two, there's not a huge amount of shift. So the Booker data is to a large extent matching the background population. It's not that we're getting kind of complete switches, but what we've done on the next couple of slides is to kind of hide everywhere that stays the same. So we just see the ones that are changing. So in the population, we have all these different areas with kaleidoscope creativity, certainly to the west, and up in the northeast, a couple of little pockets of experience seekers that switch, and largely they are switching to metroculturals further in, or experience seekers slightly further out, or again, some of these kind of the groups that we saw so many of in Havering are popping up as the highest bookers up towards just past Waltham Forest and in that kind of area between Barking and Havering. So the booker population does look very similar, but again, it skews more in this direction. So in some ways, it's those, particularly those two highly engaged groups, will kind of rise up out of the overall population when we start looking at booking data, as we would probably expect. And so here, this is just showing some of those key groups and where they're most concentrated. So we can see, for all that we've talked about kaleidoscope creativity being really large in the overall area, there is still quite a lot of differentiation in terms of concentration. So huge numbers in Newham. Indeed, some wards are clocking in at 100% in this one particular segment, which is not something I remember seeing very often for any segment anywhere. So really concentrated, also to some extent in Barking. We see again that patch that was quite high for metroculturals is sort of empty of kaleidoscope creativity pretty much. It's the lowest of the range here. If we then look at experience seekers, so we see that they didn't quite make it right into the centre, but there's a big band and stretching further out, but then only just like a corridor stretching out east. Otherwise, kind of largely missing from lots of those other areas. Which might prove an interesting challenge to those of you that are particularly dependent on them. The metroculturals very heavily pushed towards the centre, but again with a slightly sort of outlying group, which is, and again that was the area we were just talking about, that was sort of just east of the Olympic Park. Okay, and then finally, just to look at where the families are. So we saw high concentrations of families in Barking and Dagenham, and sure enough, it shows up there. Newham has similarly high concentrations, but there's a little bit of contrast within the borough. So the western edge of the borough, as you head towards central London, is actually quite low in terms of proportion of families, and so that kind of averages out. But actually, most of Newham is behaving pretty much like Barking and Dagenham, and even to some extent like Redbridge. So we could have seen these got quite big concentrations of families by proportion of population, bearing in mind that the national average is about a third of households with families. So the two darkest colours are kind of essentially the ones that are above average. If we then look at that as sheer numbers, of course, because we saw the greater concentration of population further west, we therefore see the shift towards, if just measured by numbers, there are actually more families in Newham than in Barking, say, just because of the greater population. Okay. So that is an initial run through of the background population. Does anyone have any thoughts or reflections on any of that before we look elsewhere? Is it all making sense so far, and is it kind of like a useful overview of who we've got? Lovely. Okay. What I suggest we do is just take a quick 2-minute break, so we can then move on from thinking about the population to then thinking about sort of audience data and audience behaviour. Okay. So if everyone's okay, literally just take a couple of minutes, chance to stretch your legs, refresh your cup of tea or whatever, and then we will carry on. Well, let's say 1:45. So if people had a chance to take a little moment. If you are back here and want to put your camera back on, then that's reassuring that I know that it's not just me chatting to Elise, which we do plenty of. Okay. So yes, if when you're back, you could just drop a note in the chat or pop your video back on, just so we can see that people are back with us, and then we will get back underway. Salma, brilliant. Thank you, Grace. In which case, I'm going to take it that you're speaking for everyone, and forge on with the next part. So, so this next bit is looking at some of the audience finder data. So looking at who's engaging, but it's worth flagging that we are looking at attenders within this area, not just at venues within the area. So this could be people from East London attending literally anywhere in the country. As it turns out, as we'll see in a minute, without too many spoilers, that largely isn't what's going on, but nonetheless it could be. So what we're talking about here is very much about the overall picture. So what we can see, broadly speaking, is that there are very high levels of engagement. These figures are multiple times what we've seen in some of the other local events we've done, and showing growth across the period we looked at. So obviously we've looked at just a pre-pandemic period just to get a sort of, if you like, a sense of normal behaviour. All of these with a certain amount of growth, albeit not huge levels of growth, and that's something which we will say a bit more about in a sec. But nonetheless, some very substantial volumes, both in terms of actual sales and money, but also just in terms of the number of people involved. What we do appear to have seen, though, is that whilst everything has grown in these initial periods, the number of performances has grown faster than anything else. So what appears to be happening is that the audience is getting progressively more broadly spread out. So that's something maybe just keep an eye on, because obviously that's what you're seeing, your costs potentially rising from performances more than you're sort of seeing it, those events getting a little bit more sparsely occupied. We've seen the income grow, but not faster than the number of tickets to a great extent. And you would expect, given inflation, that the income line should gradually pull away from the number of tickets, and it hasn't been so much. So that's just, again, something just to be a little bit aware of. That there is a chance that effectively income has been falling by the time you account for inflationary effects. However, there has been some growth, 6% growth in income per ticket over the 3-year period. It's just that inflation has been running a little bit higher than that in total. So when we look at art forms, there does appear to be a bit of a growth in children and family, which we will come back to when we start to look at the change in profile. But if we look at who's been engaging, so 1 second, so I've got the cameras hiding the actual slides there, which is not very helpful. So yes, if we look at, particularly let's focus on the chart top right, if we look at the profile of bookers in East London relative to the households in East London, this is where we see that kind of flip back that I talked about in terms of compared to the London population. So the metroculturals are very heavily overrepresented, double the proportion of metroculturals that are in East London are in the booking data, and the proportion of kaleidoscope creativities is equivalently substantially down. So you're kind of getting that kind of reset effect, which means if we now compare that to the chart on the left, that was showing East London compared to London in terms of population, and we saw that it was low for metroculturals and high for kaleidoscope creativity, and that's why it's kind of come back into line. Does that make sense? Other than that, probably not a huge number of other particularly notable things to pull out, partly because of the preponderance of these 3 key segments. Experience seekers are a little bit over-indexed compared to the population, but not hugely. It's worth bearing in mind that although they're kind of highly culturally engaged, they tend not to be as engaged in kind of ticketed or so-called sitting down art forms. So that's maybe not as much a surprise as it might appear to be on the surface. Particularly if we think about the fact that the experience seekers locally tend to be those student and sort of young graduate experience seekers as opposed to the older and more established ones. In some ways, that's just actually pretty good performance with this group, which is no doubt influenced by large amounts of cultural supply locally. So this next chart looks like a little bit of a tangle of wires, but trust me, and we'll draw something out of it, which is we've essentially set the proportions of each segment for whatever they were in 2016-17 and said, treat that as 100. Now, how does it change since then? So it's sort of indexed against 2016-17. The bit that's grayed out is just to say, let's not get too excited about minor changes around 100. But anything that's outside of that band, which is in fact most things, there's maybe something going on that's worth having a bit of a look at. And here, the thing that really stands out is that the trips and treats group has really grown. It's a very small group, but proportionately, it's grown very substantially across this time period. Facebook families as well, low-income families, but then that's grown. So we've got kind of family audiences doing really strongly over time, growing really strongly. On the flip side, the groups that seem to be dropping most are largely, not exclusively, but largely some of the older groups. So particularly Heydays and Home and Heritage were the two oldest groups in terms of audience spectrum. They're both dropping, or at least growing least. So it does seem to back up. This is kind of like a pre-pandemic trend of movement towards families and lower income families, and maybe away from some of the older, and indeed maybe even some of the higher engaged groups are growing, but nowhere near at the same rate. And one of the things that we found really curious as we've looked at things through COVID is that there are a number of these pre-existing trends which then got supercharged by COVID. So as, if you like, as luck would have it, families were much more likely to want to attend during and beyond COVID than they were than non-families. And older groups, the ones who are most reluctant to re-engage and re-attend. So this trend was already happening, and it's likely to get more extreme. What we are seeing, though, is that Londoners are relatively keener to go back to engaging than other parts of the country in general. And that's partly because these, a younger population, some of these sort of highly engaged groups in high concentrations like metrocultural experience seekers. So we are seeing in London quite a big push towards engagement, but also the families are likely to be a big part of that, which again is maybe going to affect some of those areas which have fewer of the metrocultural experience seekers. So out towards Barking, Newham, etc. May well still see a kind of appetite from families, albeit within the context of the cost of living crisis and so forth. So there is potential appetite. We just need to work out, what are the viable ways of meeting that need. Does anyone have any, again, comments or reflections in the chat? Does that kind of match what you would expect to see as a local trend in terms of the more families and fewer older audiences? Have you been kind of working to try and boost some of these? Is it shift in programming? I think it might well be. It's quite tricky for us to say, certainly in some cases without delving into it more. It would be nice to think that it was the policy kind of really working. But there has been, I see a lot of talk from Arts Council about older audiences as well, though, and that doesn't seem to be playing out. But yes, certainly booster family programming, family arts campaign, etc., does appear to have been sort of taking root. In terms of the museum, have you found yourself sort of focusing more on particular groups, or seeing a sort of overall shift in profile? And do feel free to answer on mic if that's easier. I appreciate you may be in the office, might not want to, but how's that?
Can you hear me now?
Yes. Hi.
Great. So yes, family groups remain a priority for us, definitely. But another group that's a priority for us is definitely what we would describe as the kaleidoscope creativity segments. As you rightly pointed out, they're quite significant in that part of Hackney that we're situated in. We're on the borders of Tower Hamlets, Shoreditch, that nexus where kaleidoscope creativity is quite strongly represented, either because that's where they work or because they live in some of the developments surrounding the area. So they are definitely a priority for us, and metroculturals, of course, are almost a given, given our location. But definitely family groups are a priority, and we are seeing that rising trend, exactly as you've reported. Kaleidoscope creativity slightly less so, but that might be more to do with other factors which are currently in play and which are very particular to the Museum of the Home.
Okay.
I'm referring to the statue of Robert Jeffrey, of course.
I was wondering. Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah. So, but I suppose were that issue able to be resolved?
Yes. Yes. I think it would. I think it would make a significant difference.
Yeah.
Chatham House rules and all that, you know.
Indeed. But it's a good point, and it also it's quite good to be able to show how all these things actually intersect, and that it's the politics of the issue and the audience profile and the engagement and the business plan and all these things actually are very much interconnected. Of course, you've had quite a big redevelopment, haven't you? Is that result in a big shift in itself, or is it more about welcoming back?
Well, we reopened in June of 2021, so and obviously lockdowns partially returned at various points through the period since then. So it's been a little difficult, and COVID hasn't gone away. But audience numbers certainly are rising and rising steadily. I suspect we'll start to see more of a bounce when international visitors return as well.
Yes. And yes, I've been having various conversations with colleagues about the impact of international visitors in London in a way which obviously we're not seeing elsewhere. So we're often seeing things moving in London not as differently as we would expect the rest of the country, but it's because London would normally be topped up by large numbers of international visitors. So although the local population in London is probably more engaged or keener to come back, that's offset by that quite big tourist shortfall. Interesting. Are you collecting enough audience surveys to be able to track the profile, the audience spectrum profile of people yet, since you reopened, or is it you still waiting to get to a quota?
We're doing pretty well.
Okay, so I guess that might be an interesting one just to track and compare back. But yes, but maybe hopefully this as context might be useful to kind of see if certain groups are moving in that direction, maybe that's just reflecting a wider trend as well. Okay, well, thank you. So now we'll have a bit of a look at where people are engaging from. Now there are some caveats on this. In fact, sorry, not on this bit. It's the next bit. So this is where I was saying that although that we are looking at audiences from East London that could be going anywhere, in practice, they're attending in London, and really in pretty high concentrations in East London. If you think of the proximity and the scale of the other venues available, even discounting the fact that some of the big commercial West End venues maybe we don't have in here, but high concentrations still attending in East London, mainly otherwise in the rest of England, and if they are attending outside of London, it's generally east of England as opposed to anywhere else. So really quite a strong skew. Very local audience, certainly compared to what we've seen elsewhere in the country for equivalent size areas. It's very, very local, because I guess the thing is that people will tend to, if you like, attend up the scale in terms of sort of size of city or size of, you know, kind of prominence of cultural attractions, and there isn't anywhere up the scale elsewhere in the country from London. So I guess that's why it's probably staying very local. So that's the case. The proportion staying in the local area, and just to check, Elise, that 41% is in East London rather than London as a whole.
Yes, that's East London.
Okay, so it's a more local attendance pattern for survey organisations, which will tend to be museums and galleries, but not exclusively. But here now, when we look at the proportion of households who are booking, we see sort of several different patches emerging, really. We've got the ultra high engagement level around Hackney and Tower Hamlets, edge of the city, where there are loads of metroculturals. We see a big patch of engagement in Havering and out towards the kind of more sort of suburban type profile. We sort of like a middling patch, and then we see Barking and Dagenham relatively, you know, in terms of population and households, with lower audience concentrations, which again, I guess is what we would perhaps expect. That pattern does spill over a bit into Newham, but not maybe as much as I might have otherwise assumed. So that's probably interesting. So that's the overall kind of density of population. Viewed in pure numbers, again, we get a sort of like a similar kind of picture. If we just look at bookers to London but not East London organisations, and this is just looking at the booking data, again, it concentrates even more heavily into that kind of metrocultural and adjacent patch towards the west. So if you like, if we're discounting the kind of intra East London engagement, it really is very much those people who are the ones who are going to a greater extent elsewhere. And of course, by elsewhere, that's obviously largely the centre as opposed to other outlying areas. But if we look at the picture relative to local organisations, it's again, it's much more spread. So it's much more evenly balanced between these two poles at the either end of the East London. So I just flick between those two again, so you can see, you know, very heavy concentration one way. And indeed, if you look at the numbers on the scale as well, because that can be quite helpful, right? Oh, the heron's just flown past the window. That's exciting. And then we go back, and the numbers on the scale drop substantially, but it is much more even. So, but again, still higher out in the west. Now here, this is the one that's going to need a little bit of explaining, because I think the map is really helpful, but only if you handle it carefully. So this is very much a kind of like, you know, don't try this at home kind of effort. What we've looked at is which of the boroughs people in any given ward are most likely to attend in. Okay, but we've not been able to include any borough that we've only got a single ticketing venue in. So that's the ones with little red X's. So what that means is that there will be some of those areas that would be coloured whatever additional colours we chose, but we, for example, didn't want to give away lots of details about Queen Theatre Hornchurch and their audience catchment area, because that would be unfair, and you know, we don't share information about individual organisations without express permission. So this is only showing the spread between those four areas where we do have multiple venues within this patch. But I do still think it's potentially interesting, and we can look at the detail behind this by looking at the heat map of each of these four separately afterwards. But I suppose so the health warning is, let's not draw any big conclusions about what's going on in Barking or Havering or Walton, but we can see some interesting things elsewhere. So for example, Redbridge has pretty broad coverage across the area, but actually there are higher concentrations of people attending venues in Newham in the west-hand edge of Redbridge. Now it could be that's also then swamped by Waltham as well, but certainly Redbridge itself is not going to be the highest in that patch. If we look at Hackney and Tower Hamlets, there's a kind of a slight sort of skew clockwise where Tower Hamlets is spilling into Hackney a bit, but Newham is spilling into Tower Hamlets a bit, and that probably is a pattern that's worth noting in terms of the engagement patterns. What's happening in the other areas, obviously, it's a little bit harder to say. But yes, but maybe worth noting that Hackney is managing to leapfrog. So whether or not it's higher than Barking and Dagenham, or indeed even Havering, it is higher than Newham in East Barking, or actually in Dagenham, I suppose that would be, wouldn't it? So you can see that kind of the attraction of some of the venues up in Hackney is kind of spilling out further, and you often see that when there's kind of like really sort of big popular venues with other things in between. You get this kind of overflow where there's a patch where they're not dominant, but then they do reappear later on. So does that make sense as an attempted overall summary? I appreciate there's a complexity in that, which do please encourage all the other venues across East London to join, and then we would never have this problem again. We're talking about it, we'll just be able to share the whole thing. But let's look at that in more specifics, and hopefully it'll become clearer. So Newham organisations, so Booker's 2 Newham organisations are heavily concentrated up in that northwest corner. There is also that band which we saw popping out as the sort of high numbers of metroculturals, who are obviously clearly highly engaged and therefore, likely to appear in there. So that's where the skew is for Newham venues, and that's probably Theatre Royal Stratford East. Yes, partly.
These are all venues in Stratford, yes, which is why it's concentrated that corner where Stratford is. Yep.
Yeah. Yes. So no spoilers, but obviously TRSA is quite big. Redbridge, it skews, interestingly, it skews west, even though that was the bit that it didn't turn out to be dominant, which is kind of interesting, curious one, but I think it's just smaller venues. You can see the total number of bookers is much lower. If we look at Hackney, it's concentrated, particularly in Hackney itself, but it is, you can see like the north half of Tower Hamlets, but not really so much elsewhere. Tower Hamlets, though, is centred on that kind of right in that borderland between them and Hackney, which probably explains why they're spilling north into Hackney in terms of which venue is dominant, but really not that much from that far away. Yes, so we're seeing these kind of different patterns of concentration, but really, pretty localized in terms of reach. Okay. Then, in terms of the survey data for people within the local area, what we saw is across the board, people were most likely to have attended in the previous 12 months. And bearing in mind that we're looking at data from pre-COVID, because clearly that's done all sorts of horrible things to all these kind of calculations of how frequently someone's attended. It's not the worst effect of COVID, clearly, but yeah, it's one of them. But we are seeing relatively high levels of first-time attenders in those areas furthest out to the east. So Barking, Dagenham, and Havering, whereas the concentration, to some extent, is higher of people who've been back quite recently, as you get more towards central London. That's probably partly reflecting the higher mix of metroculturals and very sort of super frequent engagers. And then the other thing, if we look at the average drive time people say they've travelled, again we see Barking as a bit of an interesting outlier. So broadly speaking, drive time increases. It doesn't mean we're actually driving, but the distance they've travelled increases as you go further out, as you would expect, with the exception of Barking Dagenham, which is a super local audience, which I guess picks up on exactly that comment in the chat about people being very proud of their local area, being kind of quite focused on their local area. So maybe more people attending from very locally as opposed to travelling in or indeed necessarily travelling out. That's kind of, I think, quite a notable bit sticking out there. So, does anyone have any queries about any of that before we move on? Is that all All clear? Does it align with what you'd expect? Okay. Let's keep going. So the cultural participation monitor, as I said, we looked at a representative sample of the whole population, but within that we can then take sort of more detailed slices. Now we know that a very large part of the London population, 3/4 of the London population, is in these three groups: metroculturals, experience seekers, and kaleidoscope creativity. We also know from looking at those groups and their behaviour overall across the population monitor is that they tend to, in all sorts of different ways, have been acting in kind of lockstep with each other in a way that's different from other groups. So they all tend to be more based in cities, whether or not in London. They all tend to be more urban, more inclined to engage digitally during the pandemic, in person once they can after the pandemic, be keener to attend more in future as opposed to less compared to other groups. So we've seen lots of similarities. So we've kind of bundled those three together as a kind of, if you like, a super group, so to speak, and then looking at them compared to some of these other groups to see what's going on. So one of the things that we have looked at is whether the attitudes of this particular group is different from other groups, and whether it's different specifically in London as opposed to elsewhere, because we have seen that London itself on aggregate is behaving differently, but of course it has lots of these groups, so we wanted to see if we can differentiate. So when we ask the general population, and this is taken from wave 5 in November, what do you think we should do about COVID? What's your attitude to it? Should we do everything we can to reduce it, or should we just make a bit of an effort, or we just sort of like shrug and get on with life? Most people think that we should do everything we can to reduce it. That is less the case. Well, that's even more extreme for other segments outside London, and it's about in line with that for these particular groups outside London, but it's less likely for these groups in London. So there's a greater extent to which these highly engaged urban groups, or mostly highly engaged urban groups, do think that we should make some efforts, but within reason. So we are seeing a bit of a difference, both in terms of these groups and both in terms of London. So both of those things are kind of compounding each other in terms of overall effect. If we then look at willingness to attend, are you happy to attend yet or not? We are seeing a difference between these particular groups in London and other groups in London, quite a substantial difference in terms of how happy they are to attend. But really it's about the group, it's not about London. So we can see there that those particular groups across the rest of the UK are also much more happy to attend. So that tells us that there may be a difference in kind of attitude to COVID that's both these groups and also compounded by London. But actually in terms of what people are prepared to do, the impact is really just about these particular groups of people. So people that fit these, the profile of metroculturals, experience seekers, kaleidoscope creativity, they are more willing to attend, and it's about that. It's not just about London itself. Of course, because there's so many of them in London, that means that on average, London gets pulled in that direction. But really, it's not just London. Does that make sense? I'm aware that's one of the more convoluted things I've tried to explain today, but hopefully that comes across. If we then look at this group and what they've done during COVID, whether in person, online, or participatory work, in each of those three blocks, metrocultural experience seekers and kaleidoscope creativity as a kind of super group is above average in general, but it's more above average in London. So that does appear to be a kind of London compounded effect. It's probably partly about supply and partly about a kind of selection effect, in that if you're motivated by really high levels of cultural engagement, you're likely to have gravitated to live in the place that has the most on to do. So that's probably partly what's going on there. But yes, for those groups in London are the highest levels of engagement we've seen, the sort of any groups anywhere, essentially. So when you think that, I think across the UK population in a non-pandemic year, you get about 78% of people doing things in person. These groups are doing that in London, even with the pandemic on. So that gives you a sense of quite how strong the difference for these groups is. It's enough to offset the pandemic in general. Okay. And of course, really high for online stuff, because very digitally engaged groups, also skewing younger, skewing higher education, etc. Okay, so quite a lot there that we've run through of different sorts. So a whole big talk about the background population, lots of stuff about the particular audiences that are and aren't engaging, and then a bit more there looking at some of the attitudes. And yeah, I can give you a little teaser of the information about the latest wave of the population monitor, that it does seem to be that willingness to attend is rising, although we haven't yet got to the kind of crosstabs in terms of whether it's rising more in one place or another, but it's likely to be highest in London still, because it has been the whole way through. So given all of those different things we've seen, and given your experiences over both the past few months and looking further back, what do you find notable or surprising or interesting or puzzling about any of the stuff that we've shared? So we're just going to share a few moments to discuss amongst ourselves, all sort of within the room, so to speak. So we're not going to do breakouts. We're just going to So absolute headline, we're seeing loads of these three groups we talked about quite a lot so far this morning, both in the population and in the Booker profile, of course, but notably the Booker profile skews it back towards looking like the overall London population, and these groups being the ones who are particularly keen to attend and engage, albeit with some emphasis on whether it's people being in those groups or being in London, which is the driver, which we've seen sort of varies by circumstance. We've seen big variation by boroughs, so particularly those four kind of groupings we talked about, the two sort of inner city ones, and then that kind of cluster of three that was slightly further out, Barking and Dagenham being slightly a law unto itself in terms of higher concentration of families and maybe lower engagement but more localized. And then Havering looking much more like a sort of southeast audience, even though it's in London. We've seen that growth, but not super strong growth pre-pandemic. And it's not unique to here that we've been seeing the number of performances outgrowing other things, but it's maybe something to keep an eye on. But that change in the family audience and the older audience sort of heading the other direction, particularly in mid and lower gauged, but a very, very local audience and a very heavily concentrated on London audience, which again is unsurprising for reasons we've touched on. So just zooming in terms of headlines on these three segments, metroculturals sort of double overrepresented compared to the population, so it's accounting for 1 in 3 of the bookers. But generally speaking, it's that M2 subsegment, it's the younger ones. And basic to be really keen to return. Similar picture with experience seekers, it tends to be the younger subsegment. They're also very keen. It's much more in line with the local population, 1 in 6 as opposed to 1 in 5, so it's quite similar. But absolutely enormous volumes of the kaleidoscope creativity, up to more than 4 in 10. Although the proportion drops in terms of bookers, it's still really high. It's quite an even split between the two subsegments. So it's the full range of kaleidoscope creativity. It's not just one particular bit. Of these groups, they're the ones that maybe look most exposed to the cost of living crisis, but of course it could impact all sorts of different people in different ways. Fab. And yes, thank you very much, Sanjit. And great to hear your reflections. And thank you for the comment about enhanced segmentation. Has anyone else got any comments on that in terms of is it useful? Is there other things that would be helpful to explain it more clearly? Just as an initial kind of first public viewing of it. Do please add any comments on that. That would be really welcome. But just while you're thinking about that, while you're doing that, I will just wrap up by saying that we will be sharing this. We'll put the slides on the audience agency community, which is easy to sign up via that link. So community.theaudienceagency.org. And also, if you have further questions or comments, or you maybe go away and think about it and sort of come back tomorrow and think, oh, what about this? Then please just add it there, and we'll be in touch. We will of course send you a survey, not just because we love doing that, but because we do really value your feedback and opinions, and obviously, particularly in relation to the segmentation, it will be really helpful. Yes, the mapping is in the plans. Yes, it would help, wouldn't it? We'll also look at whether we can look at some of that sort of dominant segment within those plans as well. Oops. If you want sort of the other audience finder or audience agency related events and things in the near future, there are some free surgery sessions, so you can have one-on-one conversations with people about your audience, and maybe referring to some of the content of this. That will be helpful. There are in-practice sessions to give advice and guidance, or indeed some particular sessions, whether about museums, visual arts, Christmas shows, or just how to use Audience Finder and sort of getting up to speed on it. And finally, we do little monthly sessions, picking up a whole range of different topics in a nice informal layout called Tea Breaks. The next one is on the 13th of April and is looking at summary sales dashboard information that we've got, that we're sharing to sort of show what's available. But we also, each time we'll drop in on a very different subject. So there might be one about, participation and engagement, or we don't want digital beyond the pandemic. So that hopefully might be a useful thing to pop in on. Again, those are free as well. But beyond that, I just wanted to say thank you very much for coming along, taking part, sharing your thoughts and experiences. And if you do have any questions, do please get in touch with either me or one of my colleagues, and we'll do what we can to help. But yes, good luck with everything as it emerges post-pandemic.